Okay, our first briefing on a recently concluded ERIC research project has to do with intellectual property management, evaluation, and valuation, and it was led by Dr. Claudia Stewart and Mr. Richard Beutel, both from Georgetown. Over to Richard for the briefing.
Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Rich Beutel. I'm here on behalf of our entire team, our leader, Claudia Stewart. We had Mike Ryan, who is a very, very capable professor at the business school discussing international innovation systems and the like, and the nexus of innovation in business systems. Sonia Kastner, who's an adjunct at Georgetown as well, was instrumental in this report. And we had a baby lawyer, Carrie Wessing, who was extremely helpful as our research coordinator. My background is 10 years on Capitol Hill, both on the House and Senate side. I was the original author, staff author, and legislative manager of legislation called the Federal IT Acquisition Reform Act, or FITARA, and had opportunities to work in IT acquisition as a specialty as a 25-year recovering government contracts lawyer. So that's my background writ large. But it was a great team, extremely interesting work, and I think we found some very interesting results as a result of our activity. Just to describe the process that we went through, we basically initiated this project with a comprehensive literature review. There's a tremendous amount that's been written in respects of technical data rights and the nexus of innovation and the acquisition system. So we did a comprehensive survey of the literature as a starting point for our research and to undergird our findings. Simultaneous and in parallel with the literature review, we conducted almost 40 interviews of major thought leaders throughout government. And these included folks like Dick Ginman, who's now the Air Force Secretary, Shay Assad, that we've known for many, many years. Thought leaders like Bill Greenwald, who's former SASC staffer and a true thought leader in respects of where we stand to bring innovation to the warfighter, and a host of other folks. And all of this original research and original inquiry led up to a large roundtable that we hosted and conducted going forward that had a very good turnout, and I thought was an extremely interesting dynamic and collaborative dialogue going forward. We also prepared and completed a systemogram, which is a visual representation of many of our findings going forward. Our goals and objectives in doing this had to do with trying to develop customizable intellectual property management modalities, basically evaluation and valuation of IP. And we were looking specifically to come up with lean and cost-effectively acquisition of necessary data deliverables, CDRLs, DIDs, data item descriptions, and license rights in the context of the emerging consensus for specially negotiated license rights. That's a newish type category that is meant to bridge many of the gaps we see between the other core areas of technical data rights. Limited, restricted, and government purpose are their names. We also were extremely interested on the tension points between DoD and commercial innovators. And I'll talk a little bit more about commercial innovation and why it's so key now going forward. And we wanted to see what were the areas of dissension, what were the areas of contention, why is it the case that so many non-traditional companies are reticent to do business with the government across the board. Oh, by the way, it isn't just the traditional contractors. I mean, Google and others, large hyperscalers, have had lots of tension internally about doing business with DoD. You may have seen a year and a half ago with the Jake issues in Google and the like. And so these issues permeate the tech industry writ large, but also particularly the non-traditional and smaller companies that have this reticence to wanting to do business with DoD. And we were most interested in why that was the case and what those differing philosophies were going forward. So I'll touch briefly on some of the challenges that came out of this work, and in particular the interviews and the literature search, as well as our IP roundtable that we did. One of the key things that jumped out was the continuing focus by DoD on tangible assets. And if you look at the data going forward, $92 billion on IT is the current projection for how much the government's going to spend. That's across all of government. That's the Title 40 civilian agencies, as well as the Title 10 DoD entities as well. It's a lot of money. But within DoD, you see a focus on major defense acquisition programs, kinetic platforms, and the like, and less of a focus on the fact that things are going digital. And the bulk of DoD procurement is now services, not goods, not tangible hardware, but by and large, and to a very large degree, what DoD buys on a day-to-day basis are service offerings. And this is reflective in the transition to digital warfighting, and the fact that while kinetic platforms are key and essential, one can think of them, and I'm thinking now of, say, the F-35. I mean, I think of the F-35 not as a bomb platform or a gun truck type thing. I think of it as a supercomputer with wings. And what brings that program into the 21st century and makes it so lethal is the technology that's baked into the airframe, not the airframe and the landing gear. And it's a different way of thinking about things going forward. And if you look at how the DoD and the warfighter is moving to an all-domain digital enterprise-wide approach, and the importance of technology, you get away from the kinetic platforms in terms of criticality and really start to think a little bit different about them. And this was a key narrative that ran through a lot of our research and our interviews that kept coming up over and over again as we conducted our outreach and the like. You know, another thing that jumped out at us was how divergent the business models are between DoD and the commercial sector. DoD's focus on using a price or cost model for valuation, what expense is necessary to recreate the IP and the like, doing a kind of a bottoms-up build-up is something, for those of us that do cost reimbursement contracting, are very familiar with TINA and CAS and cost accounting systems and the like, where you want, you know, your should price and all of these types of things that Shea Assad was so active in formalizing and pushing out and the like. But commercial sector, you know, in the private industry, they don't think of it in that fashion. They use completely different business models and different thinking. They talk about market and income opportunity. And the fact that you have this wide divide between the way DoD thinks about how these things ought to be costed and priced and the way the commercial sector does created many controversies and a lot of tension points going forward. And so as we address these issues and sought to harmonize these two approaches and thinking, it was clear that this is one of the key focus areas that need to be looked at in terms of IP valuation methodologies and the like going forward, and was a key finding of our report. Now, the other 2 points I'll make are well known. We have hammered them to death. A lot of companies in the commercial space talk about the complexity and burdensome nature of the DoD acquisition process writ large, the burden it places particularly on small vendors, the time frames associated with it, and how FAR-based contracting is so unnecessarily cumbersome and does not reflect the acquisition of technology in any kind of appropriate way or any kind of practical or pragmatic fashion either. So to that extent, that perception was widespread throughout all of our interviews going forward and the like. And now we all know very, very capable KOs and COTRs, contracting technical reps and the like, who know how to navigate the FAR and who can streamline things using existing FAR authorities. I'll tell you, those people, though, are few and far between. And in many instances, the compliance nature of the attitude taken And the separation of the acquisition and contracting team from the program office folks did not create a helpful and collaborative environment, where the focus with respect to many contracting officers had more to do with checking boxes and ensuring that we met the full and open competition mandate of procurement as codified by the Competition and Contracting Act. I mean, that's our lodestar, is to drive full and open competition. And I'm a SECA purist and believe in full and open competition in that regard. But if you're looking at the way, the fashion, and the systems that are being used, like FAR Part 15 with open market and the like, and I'm happy to get into those details, but they're truly eye-glazing in terms of how the system works and the timeframes that it takes and the like going forward. That is viewed as a significant detriment. Now, some of that is perhaps perceptual and perhaps not well-founded or accurate and the like, but that is a widespread perception. And so we'll talk about alternative and rapid procurement authorities going forward in just a second, but that's a key facet of this. And hand in glove, and I've already alluded to this point, was the fact that so many of the contracting officers and the acquisition, the 1102 community is the correct way of looking at it, don't have the necessary training and the necessary sensitivity to the nuances associated with IT and the acquisition of innovation and IT innovation writ large, which has, as I've noted, an increasing, if not essential role in bringing innovation to the warfighter. And so to that extent, we also make a series of recommendations regarding expanding training. The flagship program in this regard, out of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy and Joni Newhouse's shop, is the DITAP program, which seeks to train contracting officers in how to buy technology. You've also got some local centers of excellence around that know how to buy technology and acquire and deploy innovation and the like, but they're few and far between. And so the DITAP program, as I've said, is the flagship in many respects, but to my understanding, they've only trained about 500 people. Well, we need to add a couple zeros. We need 5,000 people that know how to address these issues and to acquire innovation and technology faster, better, cheaper, and not get so bogged down in the process. So we also make a series of recommendations around curricula development, training, and scale to bring the 1102 community, the contracting officers, and the COTARs and others into a more seasoned environment where they have the skills and the knowledge going forward to bring better innovation into government going forward. So I have a couple of slides that we are using the systemogram that we prepared, and I wanted to show how we came to some of these premises, so these underlying conclusions that are the foundation for the comments I've just made. One thing was that IP valuation is an art, and there's variability amongst specialists trying to put a value on intangibles. And this became very clear as part of our interview process with a number of subject matter experts who routinely and on a regular basis engage in IP valuation negotiations, either on the private sector side or within DoD. So there was a whole lot of art associated with how you come to consensus and closure that was a result of our interviews going forward. I mentioned this briefly just a moment ago. DoD needs to acquire commercial technology because that's where the R&D has migrated over the last 25 years. If you look at the difference between government R&D and the labs, which are fantastic, the labs do a wonderful job, but the center of gravity for research and development in this country is in the private sector and has been for a long time. And it's no longer an issue. It's an order of magnitude different. So the research, the development, and the technology maturation process is now primarily in the private sector going forward. And that's why DoD and the warfighter need access to innovative commercial technologies, because that's where the innovation is being developed going forward. And that's why we need to look at the different approaches and thinking between the two business models of the commercial sector and DoD and figure out how to bring them together. because this is essential. Now, Bill Greenwald, as I mentioned, former senior Senate Armed Services Committee staffer, has written extensively on this, and the fact that in terms of pure competition, we are falling behind the Chinese. We have had an arrogance here in the U.S. That we are the leaders and the like. You've had the hypersonic missile deployment just a week and a half ago that shocked our IC community and the like, artificial intelligence. I can go down the list of key and highly strategic technologies, and the Chinese are reaching at least parity and are surging past the U.S. That's just a fact, and you can look at it and you can look at the information and judge for yourself. But the complacency we have had, that we are #1 in the world in all of these areas, is no longer factually based. And so to the extent we're going to have near-peer competition going forward, we have got to figure out a way to harness our defense industrial base, and particularly our non-traditional contractors, to ensure we don't fall behind the Chinese. It is now, as Bill Greenwald has said in his publications, it is now a national security imperative that we do this. Now, I mentioned how DoD often takes a single approach for government purpose rights instead of tailored negotiated rights, and this scares away commercial businesses. Well, especially negotiated license rights is a real opportunity. It is now the favored way of going forward, but because it's not cookie cutter necessarily, and because it's not canned and the like, it requires the negotiation skills and knowledge of folks in the contracting community who know how to do this, and it is a special skill set and the like. But the DoD's focus on sustainment and maintenance, which are critical issues, and the depots are an essential element in our defense preparedness and the like. But going into these negotiations, particularly with non-traditional contractors, demanding the full ecosystem of tech data rights so that you can do reprocurement or remanufacture 25 years down the road, of your landing gear ball bearings or whatever, that's not the approach to take across the board. Sustainment and maintenance is a critical item and needs to be addressed, but almost as a separate way of thinking going forward to technology acquisition. So a new way of thinking is really necessary in this regard, so as not to scare away our innovative participants in the defense industrial base. Now, I've mentioned this. DoD needs specialized training and tools to understand commercial value and seek win-win negotiated rates and IP options. We're going to recommend that somewhere an IP valuation center and an IP valuation cadre be created, perhaps as a pilot. I think this would be a perfect home, that ERIC would be a perfect home for such a center of excellence and repository of best practices. But you could also place it within DCAA. You could also place it within the building as part of the IP cadre. I'm somewhat indifferent to where such a center would reside, but I do think we do need a center of excellence, and we'll talk in a moment a little more detail. And then we've also discussed industry exchanges and the like, and we'll talk about that in just a second as well. Now, IP valuation is difficult for all concerned. The commercial sector has many, many challenges here as well, so I don't mean to suggest this is a unique challenge for DoD. But in terms of how it goes forward, the method, the procedures and processes and the like, it is something that is difficult for all parties. And there truly is a subject matter expertise requirement associated with doing this properly. And our research clearly demonstrated that to be the case. Well, this is an eye chart, but it's representative of the systemogram that we had created and with our Team C and the like. And I always find these things kind of interesting. So I'm just showing this for what the heck purposes. Okay, I'll talk briefly about our recommendations, and then happy to answer any questions in more detail. I'd mentioned that we believe it would be highly useful and beneficial to the department and to drive broader innovation, both access and deployment, to create an IP valuation center of excellence and evaluation core. So Note there are two pieces to this. One is a venue of some kind where best practices, templates, methods, training could be housed about how best to go about this process, which is a complex and challenging process, as well as a trained valuation core, which is subject matter experts who know how the heck to do it. One nuance of this idea was to create a dispute resolution process. We were suggesting that the GAO bid protest office, Ralph White's team, perhaps have some method or some approach that could arbitrate valuation disputes. And this is as much to dispel any notion of unfairness or one-sidedness, to give comfort to non-traditional contractors that their equities would be adequately protected and there would be an independent venue to adjudicate things if they come to loggerheads in those few circumstances where that might happen or be the case. But the main thing here is to create a center of excellence and expertise someplace, somewhere, that would head those problems off primarily and provide the necessary knowledge, background, and experience to more carefully tailor the technical data requests, the data item descriptions, and the like, particularly given the transition to new paradigms of not just acquisition, but program development. I read with great interest how Kessel Run, which is one of the Air Force cells of innovation, had successfully used the software acquisition pathway for the very first time to develop iterative DevSecOps-based software on an ongoing basis with minimally viable product over time. I mean, the transition from waterfall to DevSecOps and Agile is a paradigm shift. Acquisition hasn't caught up with it yet, and our contracting techniques have not caught up with it. Now, a core problem is the budget process. That's a whole different and thorough discussion, and how the appropriation cycle does not map against the development of technology and the acquisition and deployment of innovation by the warfighter. I know DoD, as I believe it was a Defense Innovation Board recommendation, we can look at software as 2-year money now. I mean, that's helpful, and that's a key problem going forward that's worthy of a whole separate discussion. My point is simple, that existing FAR-based authorities don't map against the way, the fashion, and the engineering approaches that have now taken root, thank goodness, because we all remember, and GAO has done exhaustive research on this, how many large waterfall-based custom government systems have crashed and burned and cost the U.S. taxpayer hundreds of millions of dollars. In that regard, I'll just offer one quick anecdote, and that would be healthcare.gov. That was the premier healthcare policy initiative of the Obama administration, hugely controversial politically, and the whole program almost went down in flames because the IT systems, plural, that were to implement it did not function. They didn't work. They failed to do end-to-end testing for security assessments. It never had an ATO. We did a ton of oversight when I was on the Hill and a number of hearings about this, and it was shocking. Government doesn't do a good job of large, bespoke, waterfall-based IT systems. The history is littered with failures. GIO has documented this. So the transition, my point is simple, the transition to rapid prototyping, iterative DevSecOps-based, minimally viable product, all of those buzzwords, is a welcome approach and an essential approach in many people's opinion. And to that extent, acquisition needs to catch up with it and to map it, both the programmatic elements and the approach going forward. We also had recommended a DoD industry valuation exchange program. I mentioned how our research showed that this was difficult for the private sector just as much as for DoD, and having that rotation of people, either DoD to industry or industry to DoD, on an exchange program around this topic would be most helpful, would cross-pollinate these concerns and share them going forward. And then the last formal recommendation that we've made is to accelerate the adoption of rapid procurement techniques. And it isn't just the somewhat controversial Other Transactions Authority. This year's National Defense Authorization Act have enhanced reporting obligations. OTs are really important because I think they serve as a way to get around the more cumbersome FAR-based approaches. And we think that OTs should become a specialty. People should have special training, and they should be more widely used going forward. Of course, the big issue on an OT is once you've done with your prototype or your pilot, are you allowed to go to full production? Well, the last National Defense Authorization Act said that was okay, but it's become very controversial. Many of us recollect the dust-up with a company called RAIN 2 years ago about going to production, a small company that was given a large production contract ceiling opportunity, and perhaps was premature in that regard. But OTs play a critical assessment, and we talked to a number of subject matter experts about this going forward, and we need to accelerate that technique. DIU has taken that technique and created other offshoots, such as commercial solutions offering CSOs, a similar and related accelerated acquisition technique that is potentially going to be codified in this year's National Defense Authorization Act. And of course, you've got the cutting edge work done at DHS in their Procurement Innovation Lab. Soraya Correa, the former SPE senior procurement executive there, just retired, was an extremely forward-leaning acquisition professional who worked hand in glove with her CIO, then it was Luke McCormick, to come together to drive rapid, iterative, and effective acquisition and procurement techniques that fit the bill for technology and for the acquisition of innovation and the like. And so having said all that, except for BARDA and S&T Labs, DHS did not have OTA legal authorities, and I think they need it. And DoD has been a true pioneer in the use of OTs through DIU and the like, and that is an area that we think warrants a lot more conversation and a lot more deployment opportunities. I'll add one final comment, so I'm coming up on time here. One of our biggest challenges, and I was very pleased to hear it this morning earlier, was we could have gone so much further in this project if we could have just gotten access to data. And we couldn't get access to data in many instances, including some very relevant and germane data. So I was very happy to hear this morning the talk about we've got to break down these silos and stop collaboration on the grounds that data access might result in misuse. You know, I thought that was spot on. But we could have taken this project to a whole new level if we just had access to data. It was a big systemic problem. And one that I think needs to be addressed squarely going forward, and I know Laura will have additional comments in that regard. So that is a conclusion in terms of our findings. I'm happy to answer any questions from the group or online if anyone has comments, observations, and concerns.
So that was, I guess I have a comment, not a question. I think you have potentially 2/3 of the solution, but when data just doesn't come forth without design, without science and technology, et cetera. And we had a data problem when I first started working for the Department of Defense in 1982, and we have a data problem today, and we haven't solved it. I think you need to bring the engineers to the table with this, right? If they are not an on-par contributor to understanding how to value the data, both from what did it take me to get here and what do I need to do with in the future, I think you will never solve the problem.
Yes.
I'm also guilty of trying to solve the contracting issue and the IP rights just on the engineering side, and I know that doesn't work. Right, so I think we need to bring the engineering expertise into this, and Dinesh, you came back right in time since you put me on a panel. My challenge to you is that I think that's a good linkage between the CERC, System Engineering Research Center, and the Acquisition Innovation Research Center as to how to bring the contracting and legal communities together with the engineering communities on an equal basis to help solve this IP problem. Over.
Well, I emphatically agree, and my report here this morning is 25,000 foot level. One of the sub-conclusions was the need for capable and thorough engineering and technical participation within the acquisition process, before, during, and after, and how essential that skill set is going to be, particularly as we migrate to a more DevSecOps-based, iterative, and rapid prototyping new acquisition paradigm. So that is a sub-conclusion of our broader issue. And we also would hope that the acquisition community itself, again, our 1102 community and our COTARs, would have some rudimentary engineering understanding so that they can at least speak the lingo with the engineers going forward, or at least have a rudimentary understanding of it. So great point, and emphatically agree with those observations. Okay. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.